Hey, what's going on, everybody? Coach Connor here with another episode of Strength Coach Rants, and today we're going to be talking about the hypertrophy. So today we're going to talk about hypertrophy. All right, so it's very often mispronounced as hypertrophy, and I think that comes from people who haven't necessarily sat down in a lecture hall and heard someone say it before, because it does. If you read it in a magazine or in a book, it reads hypertrophy. It's all one word, but you would never think to hypertrophy the word. You would think, oh, it says hyper and trophy together. It's hypertrophy, but it's actually hypertrophy. All right, so all this is an increase in the size of the muscle, or like gym gains. It's the reason we go to the gym, right? We go and we lift weights and we make ourselves sore in an effort to have that muscle grow back bigger. But why does that happen? What are the mechanisms behind that? How should I do it in the gym, and which direction should I go? Because there are different forms of hypertrophy and different ways to make the muscle grow. So today we're going to be talking about all those different things and the strategies that you can use to apply to your own programming so that you can get bigger. It's going to be more like physical effort, but less kind of racking your brain trying to figure out what to do. All right, so we've established what hypertrophy is, and now we're going to kind of break down the different ways that we can make this happen. There are, in fact, 3 different ways that we can increase the size of the muscle. There is a sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, there is a myofibrillar hypertrophy, and then there's what's called hyperplasia. And for the purposes of this podcast episode, we're not really going to mess with hyperplasia today, because it really hasn't been demonstrated in humans outside of some super heavyweight, high-level bodybuilders that are on all kinds of hormones and different things. So we're gonna stick with the first 2 different aspects of hypertrophy, and break down just what happens, why they happen, and what the benefits of each are. All right, so first we're going to pull up a slide here on what's called, hold on, there we go, myofibrillar hypertrophy. All right, so what this is, it's an increase in the size of the protein structures within the cell. All right, what that means, within your muscle cell, you have these kind of contractile proteins called myosin and actin. These myosin and actin kind of pull on each other, and when you flex your muscle, you make a bicep muscle, that's them kind of shortening and coming together, and then as you go to lengthen your arm in this example, they kind of let go and get longer again. These protein structures are essentially what contribute to strength within the cell. If you didn't have these protein structures, then you wouldn't be able to fire your muscles. It just wouldn't happen. They're the parts that make the muscles work. All right, so this kind of hypertrophy is done with heavier loads. All right, so we're talking, there's a lot of data to suggest that even 1 rep maxes create this damage, and that would make sense because all this damage is going to happen when we're on the negative or eccentric portion of the lift. As you go down, you're trying to hold on, your actin and myosin are trying to hold on to each other, and you create damage, they break off. So it would make sense that it could happen even at these heavier loads, but it will kind of go all the way up into those 6 to 8, maybe even 10 rep schemes, right, where we're working at up to 70% of our 1 rep max. All right, so this kind of hypertrophy, because it does involve the contractile proteins within the cell, it's going to increase our strength, right? And it's going to increase the muscle fiber type, or size rather. So what you can think of here, though, is those protein structures don't get enormous. They're microscopic, they're tiny, and damaging them and having them grow back slightly bigger isn't going to make you a monster. That's why you can see some of these power lifters that are, in the 148 pound class that can deadlift 500 pounds, right? That's some other things too, some CNS adaptations and stuff like that. But a lot of that's because of this kind of hypertrophy. It's the kind of growth that's going to contribute to you being stronger, faster, and slightly bigger. All right. When we're in the gym, for the most part, this is the kind of hypertrophy that we really want to chase after. It's not that we don't want the other kind, but this is the type of muscle growth that's going to contribute to you being better on the field of play. All right. Now we're going to go over what's called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And this is an increase in the volume of the sarcoplasm inside the cell. So I don't know how many of you watching right now out of the roughly 30 that we typically get for this podcast, I don't know how many of you have taken a biology or anatomy and physiology class, but if you have, then you probably remember something called cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the water volume within the cell. It's got all kinds of other stuff in it, but it's basically water with some stuff in it. Sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. All right, so it's the same thing. This type of hypertrophy doesn't increase strength really because it's not contributing to the contractile protein units within the cell. It doesn't really increase the muscle fiber size, right? Because again, the contractile proteins are what make that happen. It's just an increase in the sarcoplasm, the volume of sarcoplasm within the cell. All right, so you're talking about within the sarcoplasm, we have ATP, or we have other fluid and water, mitochondria, phosphagens, calcium, potassium, and some other things. But these are the higher volume type hypertrophy gains, right? So if you look at bodybuilders, like super heavyweight bodybuilders, we're talking 275, 300 pound, 5'7", 5'8" guys. These guys are monsters. They're not nearly as strong as they look because the majority of their hypertrophy comes from this sarcoplasmic hypertrophy because they live in high volume environments. So this is like our 10, 12, upwards of 20 reps training to failure. That is how we get these adaptations. So it's not heavy loads, right? Because it's not creating a lot of damage within the cell, right? That's what the heavier loads do. This is like our 50 to 60%, even lower than that, doing things to failure. I'll go to hockey because again, I've worked with it and played the game my whole life. If you've ever done a bag skate before, right, and your legs just feel like they're on fire, or if you've done some high volume like knee extensions or hamstring curls or squats, and you just feel like your legs are absolutely on fire, right, these are the adaptations that come from that. So you look at some hockey players who don't really train in the gym all that much, right, their legs are enormous, and that's because of the game that they play. We get tons of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy from the high volume skating that we do. All right, so that's the difference between the two. You have your sarcoplasmic, right, which is what we call non-functional hypertrophy. That is, and it's not non-functional like at all, right? There's a lot of function to the things that we're getting more of within the cell. It's non-functional in the sense that it doesn't contribute to strength. Then you have myofibrillar hypertrophy, and that is the muscle growth that's going to contribute to strength. All right, so now that we've cleared that up and we've separated the two, and hopefully you have a better understanding of that, we're going to talk about like the environments that we want to train in for both. All right, so now we know like the different mechanisms behind muscle growth. How do we stimulate these things to happen? Well, I kind of alluded to it in the last section of this podcast episode. We want to train in higher volume environments if we want that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. We want to train in lower volume, higher load environments if we want that myofibril hypertrophy. Now, before we get into any of this, let me make it abundantly clear that the vast majority, all right, of the hypertrophy or muscle growth that you experience is going to be this sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. It's not like that, training with heavier loads and lower intensities is not going to make you grow. It will, but it's not going to be like what gives you those monstrous arms or those giant traps. It just doesn't work that way. Most of that is fluid, and although that we do call it non-functional hypertrophy, it is actually very functional because there is more mitochondria, there's more phosphagens, there's more calcium, there's more of all this stuff that's going to help your muscle fibers do what they're supposed to do. All right, so if I want to increase like the size of the protein structures within the cell that are going to contribute to strength, we're going to keep our volume a lot lower, right? So even upwards of, let's say 8's probably the cutoff of what I'm going to say. Those eight reps are going to create enough tension to create the damage and the actin and the myosin that's going to require, right, your body to go back and rebuild them bigger. And Cal Dietz actually made a pretty good, what's the word I'm looking for? Observation that when this happens, so you have the actin and the myosin is actually like, think of your actin like this and your myosin like this. If you can't see this because you're not watching or listening, sorry, I'll try to explain it. But the myosin head sits in the actin and it pulls and it pulls and it pulls. When that myosin head breaks off, it breaks off and gets repaired larger, right? So that's why like eccentric training works so well, is because it makes those myosin heads come back in larger and more strong and more powerful, so that transfers over to your actual strength in the gym and on the field of play. All right, and just kind of an aside here, these what am I looking for? Eccentric based programs, they will leave you crippled, but they will leave you crippled because they create so much damage, right? And the damage is how we grow. So if you're really trying to get stronger, like even though German volume training is not like a very high stimulus, if you're talking about the 10 sets of 10, we're only operating at like 50% of our 1 rep max. If you're talking about the 5 sets of 10, the modified one that's a little bit more for strength, we're still only at 75% of our 1 rep max. But the reason that you can get stronger while on those programs is because the myosin head breaks off and comes back bigger. All right, that is the reason why. So if you want to experience this kind of growth, all right, we stay within that 1 to 8 range, or we focus on the eccentric work, because that's what's going to allow us to lift in an environment where the load is heavy enough to create the damage that we want. All right, so think of it this way: if I am doing a 90% of my 1 rep max on the squat, right? And just to make this easy, my max is 100 pounds and I'm doing 90 pounds, right? As I go down, I'm having to handle a heavier load. I'm creating more tension within my muscles, which is going to create more damage. If I do that to failure, I'm probably only going to get 4 or 5 reps, right? If I train at 50%, right? So now we're at 50 pounds. That's very sub-max. I'm not going to be able to create the same amount of tension in my muscles as that heavier load does, so it's not going to create the same kind of adaptations. Now, what I'm doing, even if I take it to failure and, on paper, your 50% of your 1 rep max is like your 20 rep max, the kids will get 40 to 50 in this space, so like none of that holds up. But you're not losing the ability to like contract the muscle because you're not strong enough or because there's been so much damage. You just don't have like the metabolic products rather to be able to create energy to be able to continue to go. So that's the biggest difference between the two. When we're in those high volume environments for that like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, you run out of the ability to make more energy. When you train at the heavier loads, you run out of 2 things. One, like your CNS can only like pull in so many muscle fibers, and once you've exhausted them or beat them down, they won't work anymore. So you're creating more damage, which doesn't allow your body to continue to work. Whereas on the lower end of the spectrum with that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, we just don't have the ability to continue to make the kind of energy that we need to keep going. All right. So it's not damage that creates the growth with the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and the lower loads, higher volumes. It is like our inability to keep up metabolically. That's why your body shoves more like calcium and mitochondria and all that stuff into the cell, and it makes it appear to look bigger when in reality, well, I guess it is bigger, right? But it's just not the protein structures within the cell. So your biggest difference between your functional myofibrillar hypertrophy, goodness gracious, this is a mouthful today, and your like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, right, is going to be the loads and the volume. So if you want to grow and you want to get really big, honestly, you need both. You can't just train one or the other, and we're going to kind of talk about that next. All right, so when it comes to growth, do I need just one or the other? And the answer is absolutely no. You don't need one or the other. You need both, right? We want to increase in the size of the cell because mass moves mass, and we want an increase in like the actual size of the protein structures within the cell because we need to be faster and more resilient. This is why I cannot stand the HIIT method and guys who preach the HIIT method like it's this great thing for athletes, because it's not. While you may be getting bigger, right, and you may look the part, you're all gas and no engine. The myofibrillar like hypertrophy is the engine. If you don't have the engine, like the gas doesn't matter. The same is true on the other end, right? If you want to be an athlete, we've got to be able to do these efforts and repeat them over and over and over again. I need the gas. I can't just have the engine. So you've got to think when I'm trying to grow and I'm trying to create a program that is going to be like the best possible outcome for everybody, all my athletes, think both. I've got to have gas, I've got to have engine. If I have one without the other, like it legitimately doesn't matter. So when you program the heavier load, lighter volume work and the higher volume, more moderate, more light load work, because they kind of work together on the field of play. So I get asked this question quite often. Should I just do the high volume work with like my isolation, icing on the cake exercises, or should I, just do the heavy load, light volume stuff with the bench press, the squat, the deadlift, and things like that? And the answer is sort of, right? So we can still do high volume work to failure with the major lifts if you're somebody that's, seasoned and can work to like relative exhaustion with the more complicated movements. So I don't think, it's one or the other. Now, I will say that when it comes to like chest flies and skull crushers and tricep extensions and even, any upper back work like bent over rows, seated rows, I don't find value in the like light volume, heavy load work. I don't see it. I don't think there's any value in it. I think the upper back work, what I have found in my experience and the experience of a lot of my colleagues, is the upper back muscles tend to really respond to volume and not bear, very favorably to the heavy work. That being said, I like the high volume work for a little bit of everything. I do like taking work to failure at times. It wears itself out pretty quickly. We can't live in that environment, but I think there's absolute value in squatting to failure and benching to failure and deadlifting to failure, as long as it's a physiological failure or a mechanical failure, meaning if we get so far out of place we stop. But, I don't think it's one or the other. Your isolation exercises like chest flies and knee extensions and leg curls and tricep extension and bicep curls, those are your higher volume work. You should be doing those to get a pump. That is it, right? You shouldn't, if you're strong, right? So if I've got somebody who's a 400-pound bencher, right, and they're doing 135-pound skull crushers, right, that may seem heavy to you, but that's actually really light and fairly moderate, right? So we're talking light and moderate loads for high volume, like 15 to 25 reps. We're talking about bicep curls and knee extensions and all that kind of stuff. But we can also hit that high volume work with our bench and our squat and our deadlift, thinking we're 50 to 60%. We'll train in that environment, and that way we can create a lot of fatigue, like in the system as a whole and not just in the muscle itself, and that's going to lead to a ton of growth. I will say early on in training, with the vast majority of my athletes, we experience huge gains in growth from the training to failure, and it's early in their training, so who knows, just about anything would work. But I've had kids in 2 months put on 15 to 20 pounds legit, from including that work to failure. So I would say there's absolute value in it, and there's merit in putting it into your program. We don't just have to do the high volume, moderate load stuff when it comes to the isolation exercises. We can absolutely do them when it comes to the compound, like big 3 exercises. For today, hopefully you learned something about muscle growth and hypertrophy. Next week, we're going to be talking about training to failure, a whole podcast episode on that, so it'll involve some of this. But look out for that next week, and we will see you next time.